American exceptionalism. Some people believe it, some people don't. But what does American exceptionalism mean? The goal of my journey is to get past the buzzword and explore, what does American exceptionalism really mean? I'm Janine Turner. Join me as I speak with scholars and Americans all across the United States about what American exceptionalism means to them, both historically and currently. American exceptionalism, how and why it matters.
Have you ever met anyone that is so incredibly enthralling that you just want to pull up a chair and listen to them talk for hours and hours? This is our treat for today. My special guest is Roger B. Porter. Roger Porter is an IBM professor of business and government in the Harvard Kennedy School. Joining the Kennedy School faculty in 1977, he has served for more than a decade in senior economic policy positions in the White House, most recently as Assistant to the President for Economic and Domestic Policy from 1989 to 1993. He served as Director of the White House Office of Policy Development in the Reagan administration and as Executive Secretary of the President's Economic Policy Board during the Ford administration. He's the author of several books on economic policy, including Presidential Decision-Making and Efficiency, Equity, and Legitimacy, the Multilateral Trading System at the Millennium. Roger B. Porter is an alumnus of Brigham Young University. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. He was a White House Fellow from 1974 to 1975 and received his MA and PhD degrees from Harvard University. My friends, we are in for such a treat. Roger B. Porter, his experience, his knowledge, his wisdom is such a joy. We are so lucky and thrilled to have you with us here today. Truly, truly, truly. You epitomize exceptionalism yourself. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So we're on this journey of American exceptionalism, not in a gratuitous manner, not in a, oh, aren't we fabulous, but what are the hallmarks if we're to focus on America as a benevolent country and as a good country? Where are the pockets and the aspects and epochs of history where we are exceptional? And so that's one of the things we want to focus on today.
Great.
So what are your thoughts? If you were to say, America is exceptional, what pops into your mind is one of the first things.
We began as a relatively small enterprise. We were 13 colonies, mostly huddled along the Atlantic coast. We had fewer than 4 million people. Most of the people who had come here had come because they were fleeing something else and they wanted to get a fresh start. And today we are a nation of over 330 million people, by far the world's greatest military power, and by far the world's greatest economic power. Many people believe that American greatness or exceptionalism comes from its economic prowess and its military ability. I believe that it comes from our ideals. And there are three ideals in particular that have characterized this American experiment over the last 225 years. The first is the ideal of freedom. And by freedom, I mean a commitment to having people shape their own destinies, that it's not government or some set of other institutions that are basically going to decide what we get to do with our lives, but that freedom and this attachment that we have to freedom has been something that we have cultivated and sustained throughout the period of time. I think that's one of the things that draws many people who want to come here because they think they're going to have an opportunity to shape their own destiny. Second ideal is what is frequently referred to as the rule of law. And that is that there are a set of arrangements that do not privilege one set of people over another. We haven't had aristocracies. We don't have a caste system. We don't divide our population into upper class and lower class. We sometimes refer to upper income and lower income, but we have a lot of movement between those all the time. The rule of law essentially says everyone in the society, the rulers or the elected officials and the ruled are going to be treated in the same way. It's a very powerful idea that is not common in history, and yet it's one that we have clung to for a sustained period of time. The third ideal is the ideal of equality, but it's a particular type of equality. It's not an equality of results, it's an equality of opportunity. And therefore, we adopt policies and practices that try to provide a wide array of opportunities to people, while still maintaining the idea that merit should prevail, and that when people exhibit great merit in what they do and real excellence in what they do, that they will be rewarded, that we're not seeking an equality of results. I think if you look at the last 200 years, you see quite remarkable success in all three of these arenas. Most people really enjoy the freedom and the capacity they have to shape their own destinies. One of the biggest things that came out of Tiananmen Square in China was that the young students got their greatest demand, which was that they would get to pick the jobs that they were going to go into. Before then, I'd visited China before, people were told when they graduated, you're going to be an elevator operator, whatever it is.
I filmed a movie in Communist China in 1983.
No.
Yes. And I was all by myself. I flew into Hong Kong. I was 21 years old, and then I got in a boat and was ferried over to Zhuhai, which was this. It didn't even exist yet. There was just one hotel, and everybody else was living sort of in a hut. They came with their military guns and their green coats, and went through my suitcase. And I was determined to take my Bible, even though they told me not to. You could be. Yeah. And I did anyway, and I was all by myself, and they took my passport from me and walked away, and I was like, oh my gosh. But I got through to the other side, and I remember someone picked me up from the production, and he said, were you scared? And I said, no. I wasn't scared. And he says, oh, you look scared to me. But I mean, it was very intimidating.
It was very intimidating.
And so right after that, I remember Tiananmen Square and just the man standing in front of the tanks. But I was never aware that something actually came from that.
Yeah.
So they actually did
they did relax the rule that for those who were in school. You have to remember, at the time that you and I first visited China, I first visited in 1983, ironically.
About the same time.
At the same time. And 90% of the population were living in rural areas. Mm-hmm. And I wrote in my journal, I have gone back into the 19th century because the transportation and communication systems that they had were, by our standards, very primitive. Mm-hmm. It's actually quite remarkable what's happened in the last 40 years in China economically. But they haven't, in my point of view, made the same progress in their political arrangements. And it's a very authoritarian system, and not one that tends to have a large number of people beating down the doors to get in and desiring to immigrate there. Whereas the United States is still seen, and I hope always will be, as a place where people want to come because they have this belief and conviction, which I think is true, that you have the opportunity to shape your own destiny. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what set of political arrangements do we have in this country that helps to cultivate these three great ideals of freedom and the rule of law and equality of opportunity. And if you look at our set of political arrangements, we need to remember that we started out as a group of colonies, and after declaring our independence, we started calling them states. But people didn't view themselves as Americans. The Declaration of Independence says that the states are independent. Mm-hmm. And people viewed themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers or Pennsylvanians. A majority of people never traveled more than 50 miles from the place they were born. This was not a country, as it were, and we eventually adopted, during the Revolution, the Articles of Confederation. I love the title, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. There was always this optimism that they had. But it was a very loose set of arrangements, and we kept it in place for about a decade, and it wasn't working well. People were raising duties on goods coming from other places. Foreign countries were trying to pick off various states and form alliances with them. And people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and others became very concerned that this experiment, which the British were actually quite skeptical. I mean, Cornwallis surrendered at the Battle of Yorktown, and we had the treaty in 1783 that ended the war. But they were skeptical that we would want to move out from the umbrella of the great British Navy, which is the greatest navy in the world at that time. And we would be on our own, since we're going to have to do some trading. And they thought that, at least many of them thought, that we would come back on bended knee and want to resume our relationship. So when they gathered in Philadelphia in that long, hot summer of 1787, they recognized that there were two big challenges they faced. One is the set of arrangements that they had existing weren't working. No one came there saying, what we really need to do is to preserve what we got, what they had. And the second was a very deep, profound, fundamental skepticism about the ability of human beings to handle power wisely. And they were worried about having a set of political arrangements in which a few people would have a great deal of power and essentially be able to exert that. So these two themes, we have to have something stronger. This current set of arrangements is not working. We need more of a central government. But we don't want to have a government that is going to effectively deprive us of our freedoms. It is the states, this is very unique among countries, the states that created the federal government. The federal government didn't create the states. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at the way in which the Constitution is drafted, it looks like a document that is drafted by a group of states trying to figure out what set of arrangements, because some of them were large, like Virginia, which had over a fifth of the population of the entire country at that time. Some were small. Delaware had 30,000 people in Delaware, and yet they were all states. Not surprising that Delaware was the first to ratify the Constitution, because they loved the set of arrangements there where they were going to have equal standing with the other states in one of the legislative bodies, the Senate, and would be done for the House of Representatives on the basis of population.
The Great Compromise.
The Great Compromise. One of many compromises, in fact, in the Constitution, where we were trying to figure out how do we take these 13 entities that have effectively been operating on their own, largely, and mold it into a country that can preserve the useful attachments that people have to where they live. And so we adopted a system in which we systematically divided and distributed and diffused power. If you look at the governmental arrangements in the United States, we have far more power exercised at the state and local level than almost any other country in the world. We have a little over 2 million civilian employees in the federal government, another 1.5 million in the uniformed services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. We've got 20 million people employed at state and local government. The governments that most people touch and where they really get engaged and involved are state and local governments. And it allows them to have a feeling and the reality that they have a say in what is happening governmentally in their lives, that it's not some remote, distant, unaware, unknowledgeable entity that's a long way away.
Like the president.
And we've preserved that in a remarkable way. Then we've taken the federal government and divided and distributed power there between three branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial. And if you look at each of these three branches of government, we further divide and distribute and diffuse power. We don't just have a Supreme Court, and the Constitution says there shall be a Supreme Court and such other courts as the Congress shall from time to time establish. But we have federal appellate courts and federal district courts, we have federal tax court, federal trade court, we've got a whole panoply of courts, which is unlike other federal systems like Canada, Germany, Switzerland, Australia, which have a Supreme Court. But their lower courts are state or provincial or lender courts. In the United States, we have lower federal courts. And therefore, people, companies, try to decide which courts they would like to have a case come up if it's federal jurisdiction, because they may get a different result if it's in Texas or if it's in Massachusetts. If you look at our legislative branch, it again divides and distributes and diffuses power. We have two effectively equal branches of the entities in the legislative branch, the Senate and the House. And legislation has to go through both of them in order to succeed. And if you look at where power is effectively exercised in the Congress, a very large amount of it is at the committee and subcommittee level. That's where most of the work in shaping the pieces of legislation that are going to be voted on the floor. If you look at the executive branch, Stephen Bailey once described the executive branch as a many-splintered thing. And he said it's really a loose collection of about 200 different departments and agencies, each of which has their own mission, their own resources that they get from the Congress, their own priorities. It's a very challenging thing for the person who is the chief executive of the executive branch to get control of this entity.
What would George Washington think now? He thought he had a problem with Congress.
People in George Washington's time,
The real flustered he got with Congress. He's like, I'm leaving.
Would be shocked to see the government we have today. And yet, the government we have today has adjusted and adapted. We've had very few amendments to the Constitution. The framework that was set up in the late 1700s is effectively still in place today. I think it's one of the great marvels that we've been able to take a constitution full of compromises to get it through and basically be able to use it to govern a much larger country, a much more complicated economy, a much more diverse group of people successfully. The second characteristic of this set of political arrangements is that they are very democratic and I mean democratic with a small d. They're democratic in two important senses. One is that they are very accessible. They're very transparent. You can find out, if you're outside the government, what's going on inside the government. We have Freedom of Information Act. We have Government in the Sunshine Act. We televise the floor of the House and the Senate and committees. If someone is interested, and large numbers of people are, in finding out what's going on inside government, we have a very aggressive press corps.
I was just going to say the press. If you can't get it, you go to the press.
Right.
So
we've had a much more aggressive press corps than is true in virtually any other country. We give them wide latitude. So if you're a citizen and you want to be able to have influence in the government, you need to be knowledgeable about what's going on, and we do that. But it's democratic in a second sense as well.
So the first you're saying is that it's accessible.
The first is that it's very transparent. You can find out what's going on.
Right.
But the second is that it's accessible. It's relatively easy for people outside the government, whether they're individuals or businesses or other organizations or labor or environmental groups, to get access to people, not merely in the Congress, but in the executive branch. When I worked in the White House for a little over 11 and a half years, I spent roughly 20% of my time meeting with people from outside the government. And by the way, I had no idea whether they were Republican or Democrats. There was never I had no idea whether they'd ever made a political campaign contribution. And you met with people from a whole wide variety of interests.
But so you were talking about accessibility.
Okay.
That we
So
can
it's very democratic in that you can get. I often ask students, how many of you have written a letter to a member of Congress? And then I say, how many of you have gotten a response to that letter? And almost all of them have gotten a response to letters that they wrote. How many of you have written the President of the United States? Have you gotten a response, etc.? And it's quite remarkable that the set of elected officials that we have in this country don't view themselves as remote and detached and effectively on their own. Some people might say we have a hyper-democracy. They're constantly coming back and trying to find out from the population what is it they want and what are their preferences are. I think that's really healthy. The third characteristic that is both ennobling and frustrating is the deliberativeness of our system. We have a set of checks and balances and procedures that have to go through, that to get anything done is very challenging. It's not easy. I think that's a good thing in the sense that it means that decisions are not taken quickly and lightly. That this system that we have, whether it's enacting legislation or taking that legislation and putting it out through regulations under what's called the Administrative Procedure Act, can take many months and even years. The design of it is that the people making those choices, how the regulation is going to be drafted, have to have public comment, and they have to take that public comment into account. And if you ask yourself, if there's a regulation that's going to affect me, do I want to have some say in the information that is provided to the people who are going to be making those decisions?
That's when the regulatory agencies start drafting.
Right.
So how do the people look at that, though? I mean,
the way they do it is you have to draft what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking. So they start out and they say, we're going to draft regulations consistent with this provision in this law. and then they invite public comment.
And how do they do that today? I mean,
It's done online. It's on the internet.
How was it done
now.
before? Newspaper?
It would be published in what's called the Federal Register. So people would have to go and read the Federal Register to find out.
Where was it?
It's published in Washington, and they could go at their libraries, or
Libraries,
law firms would subscribe to it, etc., to look at it. But then, after this notice of proposed rulemaking, then they draft a rule and put it out for comment. So this is what we've come up with. And they will sometimes get tens of thousands of comments. Because once you've...
I'm glad to hear there are tens of thousands of comments.
Yes. On an important one, a really important one, it will generate those comments. And they are required under the Administrative Procedure Act to review and take those into account. Now, they don't have to agree with all of them because they're coming from all sorts of different places. But if you want to overturn a regulation, the courts are much more likely to overturn a regulation, not because they think the regulators got it wrong, but because they didn't adequately take into consideration the information and the evidence that was provided.
Who's the watchdog of that, whether it needs to be overturned or not?
The federal courts. And you get...
So there's a check.
And there's
the
a
courts.
check.
So it goes to the courts? The courts have to see it?
The courts have to review it if it is appealed to them.
Oh.
If it's a normal regulation...
So the people would appeal.
And there's not enough... But if you don't like something that's come out, then...
You appeal it where?
You go to a federal court, go to a federal district court.
So I appeal the way they're writing this law.
They're saying
they didn't pay attention.
They did not. That it is, one, you can appeal it that it's inconsistent with the legislation. This is what the intent of the legislation was. The regulation that's been drafted is not consistent with that. That's one type of appeal. Second type of appeal is we provided this evidence to them, and we can see we never heard back. We don't know what happened to it. It's clearly inconsistent with what they have to be able to show in court that they not only received it and reviewed it, but they took it into consideration. They don't have to agree with it, but they have to take it into consideration. As a result, the system is such that it's very slow, methodical, plodding. A new administration comes in, and most of their regulatory activity occurs in the fourth year because they've had to, most of the new regulatory activities then, because they have to make sure that they go through all these steps or they'll get overturned. So as a result, we have a system.
You have to be a very tenacious people, though, and an informed people to know how to do that.
You have to be informed, and you have to be, I love that word, very tenacious. You have to be aware and not be afraid to roll up your sleeves and present evidence that, in fact, demonstrates that there is an important element that should be part of this consideration, or that it hasn't been based on the right facts and all sorts of things.
And that's one of the democratic elements that you're talking
That's one of the democratic elements, the deliberative elements. Mm-hmm. Now, what does it take for this to...
Can I just interject?
Please.
That really helps with unelected bureaucrats. These agencies that everyone's really worried about, that's part of the check on that.
I've had the opportunity to spend 11 and a half years working with not only elected officials and politically appointed officials, that's what I was, but with career civil servants. Most of them are highly knowledgeable in the specific area of expertise that they have. And most of them, in my experience, want to do the right thing. Most of them are willing to receive information and analysis from people outside and to try to take it into account. But they can't issue it on their own. It has to go through the political chains. So it is reviewed by if it's a major regulation, what's called the Office of Information and Regulatory Analysis and the Office of Management and Budget, which is in the executive office of the president. And they're full of people who are really smart and really knowledgeable and really committed to efficiency. And they will receive a regulation that's come out from a department or agency, et cetera, and they'll say, not the best way that could be done. We're going to engage you in a dialogue because the legislation aims at this outcome. This is the goal. But what you have come up with is not the most efficient way of achieving that goal. So it's too burdensome. Right now, we're trying to figure out how to deal with climate change. It's having a big effect on the weather. It's having a big effect on people's lives. There's no question we have to deal with it. And one way of dealing with it is regulating certain types of activities. But the rules on sustainability that businesses are now required to meet are sometimes wise and useful, and other times incredibly resource dependent, taking a lot of time and a lot of effort. Whenever anybody gets an assignment, I always ask myself the following question. So, who's going to receive what you produce? And what are they going to do with it? Is this something that's just going to sit on some shelf and you're taking a whole bunch of time and effort to produce it and then it's not going to have an outcome? Mm-hmm. One of the most important things in life, in my view, the things that separates the great people from the less great people, are how they use their time. And the great people never allow the things that matter most to be at the mercy of the things that matter least. Mm. And if you look at the successful people in any line of endeavor, just think about the people who you really admire and who you really think exhibit excellence. There are people who focus on the most important and not on the less important. Mm-hmm. Well, it's not just true for individuals, it's true for the society as a whole. If our society is going to see, what is it that causes America to be so innovative? Why do we have the most inventions and innovations way above any other country? There are a lot of other countries that are fast followers. They try to take what we have done and do it. But if you look at the great innovations over the last 200 years, certainly since...
The freedom to focus on the big things.
Yeah.
That's what you're going to say?
It is that we've got this creative society where you're not burdened mm-hmm. with spending a whole bunch of time complying with regulations that are otherwise. Mm-hmm. And
if you bog that down, then you stifle creativity.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have. Why do entrepreneurs want to come to the United States? I was climbing. I don't think there's anything inappropriate in me sharing this. I was climbing the Statue of Liberty with our youngest son, and I don't know if you've ever climbed the Statue of Liberty.
Maybe when I was.
But it's a staircase, and of course the line moves very slowly mm-hmm. because the people at the top don't want to just make way for the next person. They want to look all around, so it moves very slowly. So we're climbing the stairway. And the fellow who's below us, and now we start talking, and I said, well, where are you from? He says, well, I'm from the UK. I said, oh, I lived 5 years of my life in the UK. I love the place. It's great. I said, what do you do? He says, well, I'm an inventor. And I said, what are you doing here? And he said, oh, your venture capital markets are by far better than any place in the world. I'm talking to 5 different companies to see if they will partner in that. I tried over in the UK and I couldn't get anybody interested in it. But this place is great because there are all sorts of people who are eager and willing to undertake new ventures. A lot of them don't turn out very well. We have a lot of failures. but we have a huge number of successes. And the successes are because of people having the ability to come up with ideas and then go out and get them funded.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
without a lot of to bog them down. With freedom, it would be freedom, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think we do not fully. Hernando Soto, a Peruvian economist, wrote a great book called The Mystery of Capital, and in it he describes what you have to do in various countries to get a license, start a business, do all these things. And it's amazing how many hoops you have to go through in various places. Mm-hmm. And we have a federal system in which people get to do what? Shop around. If I don't like it here, I can go to... Why is Texas booming now with businesses moving there and employment burgeoning relative to the rest of the country? Because it's got a much lighter touch in the regulatory system. Plus, it's got a lot of oil, so which it can tax, so it doesn't have a state income tax. And a lot of companies say they want to go there, but they also want to go. Well, they like the warm weather as well, most of the time. But it's in part because it's a very what's known as a business-friendly place.
It's the 9th largest economy in the world.
It's the 9th largest economy in the world, which is quite remarkable. Mm-hmm. So what is it?
So there's not. Well, that's what happens in communist countries. They bog it down so much, you lose all the, and then no one can invent, and everyone gets complacent. And
so, what does it take for this system to work well? Well, the first thing that it takes is what I like to think of as an enlightened citizenry. It is a citizenry, an informed citizenry. And the responsibility for having an informed citizenry is not simply on the citizen, but it is on the leaders. I think one of the most important roles for the president, for members of Congress, for governors, for elected officials, is to ensure that they are communicating to the public what our real choices are. Most people want to hear what? Great news. And if you elect me and you put me in there, all these wonderful things are going to happen. Often the promises that are made are really beyond the pale. And
it really shouldn't be happening at the national government level.
And what leaders need to do is to ensure that people understand what our real choices are. If you think of what people need to decide is, I've only got so much time and we've only got so many resources. We have to figure out what's the best use for our time and what's the best use for our resources. We cannot do everything we would like. We have to choose. Those choices are going to be wisest when they're informed. What do people do when they decide where to go to college? They go visit. They look up a whole bunch of information. They make comparisons, etc. What if you just pulled a name out of the hat? Well, that wouldn't be a very useful way of making an informed decision. Well, we want to have all of the decisions about how we're going to allocate the precious time that citizens have and the limited resources that we have. And therefore, an informed citizenry is very essential. Second thing that's essential, however, is an enlightened citizenry. And by enlightened, I mean that in making these choices, they're not primarily focused on themselves and now. They are thinking about what the impact of this is going to be in the future. And they pay at least as much attention to thinking about the future as they do about the present. If you go back and read the letters written by the framers of the Constitution, and that what Warren G. Harding actually coined the phrase "the founding fathers." They didn't walk around.
Is that where it
they
started?
They didn't walk around saying we are the founding fathers. But if you look at their correspondence, it's very interesting. They write about what they are doing using a term that has fallen into disuse in our time, and that term is posterity. George Washington used it 9 times in a single speech. Thomas Jefferson's second inaugural address talks about the 1,000th generation from now. They were constantly thinking not so much about themselves or themselves and their families, but how was what they were doing going to impact people in the future. They saw themselves as part of a great enterprise experiment in seeing how a free people, not governed by a monarchy or an authoritarian regime, could shape their own destiny. And they came up with the notion. You gotta remember, there were only about 200,000 politically active Americans, because in those days you had to be male, you had to be white, and in many states you had to be a property owner. Mm-hmm. So I think it is astonishing that among 200,000 people we had in this generation, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Patrick Henry, Gouverneur Morris. I mean, it's John Adams, one of our favorites. Mm-hmm. And as a result, what was unique about them is that they were focused as much on the future and thinking about how this was going to play out as they were on the present. Then there's a third element that's key to success, and that is we have to be able to take all of these different interests, different priorities, different preferences. Your preferences and your priorities are no more and no less important than mine. They're not likely to be similar. Everybody has their own preferences and priorities, but we have to have a way to take those and bring them together and find what I like to call common ground, not compromise. When you use the term compromise, it sounds like, well, I'm giving something up that I really would like in order to get something else. I think that's the backward way to look at it. The first thing to do is to see, can we find common ground? Think of 2 ways in which people can live their lives, and societies can live their life. One way is to view it as a zero-sum game. And as a former collegiate athlete, I love competition, and competition athletically is inevitably a zero-sum game. You have winners and you have losers. And we all love to watch it, or many of us love to watch it. But that's not a very wise way to live your life. You should be living your life, and the society should be striving to find win-win opportunities. Is there something that we can come up with that will make things better than they are now, and better for everyone? And economists refer to it as a Pareto optimal solution. A Pareto optimal solution is no one is made worse off. Everyone is made better off. Not equally. Some people are made better off than others, but we adopt a solution, or we find a solution in which no one is going to be made worse off. And interestingly enough, the more you look for win-win situations in life, the more you discover them. And the more you discover, the better you get at discovering them. Think of the most important institution we have in our society, the family. It's a win-win proposition. It's not parent against parent or parents against children. You're trying to figure out something where we can all succeed and we can all win. You only successfully do it if you take everybody's interest into consideration, give everyone a voice, let them have some say in it.
And find the common ground.
Yeah.
What's an example? What's your favorite example politically of that?
Well, I had the opportunity to help develop and to negotiate the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. This is a piece of legislation that had been stalled for 13 years. It had been stalled because in our political system, to use a sports analogy, the advantage is to the defense. It's easier to stop something from happening than to score, because you have to get the president to agree, the House to agree, the Senate to agree, in what's a very partisan world. So we started out, the president, this was George H.W. Bush, had said during the campaign that he wanted to be the environmental president and the education president, and he wanted a kinder, gentler America. So when it came to the environment, the big issue at that time was acid rain. And how are we going to clean up the pollution that we had in many major metropolitan areas, including Los Angeles, where they were out of attainment 144 days a year.
They were what?
They were out of, it's called attainment. And that is, you have monitors within a city and you have a limit as to how much sulfur dioxide and whether it goes above a certain level. And if it does, and it stays above that level for 24 consecutive hours, it's counted as a day out of attainment.
Oh, yeah, well, I descended in many pink clouds in my day.
Many
going to
pink
Los
clouds,
Angeles.
exactly.
Yeah.
The next highest city at that time was Houston, which was 20 days. Los Angeles was 144
Wow,
days.
yeah.
And there were about 9 major metropolitan areas that had a real problem. But at any rate, getting back to how this act was fashioned. Before we started drafting the provisions, we held meetings with all sorts of organized interest groups, the oil and gas industry, the automobile industry, the farmers, the miners, etc., manufacturers, and we held meetings with members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate. I said, he said, how many meetings are you prepared to do? I said, we can't meet with 535 people individually, but I'm going to let you decide how many meetings. I do not want, when we finish, anyone to say, well, they wouldn't meet with me. So you can come up. We ended up having 21 meetings with various groups, the Steel Caucus, the Democrats on the Environment and Public Works Committee, the Republicans on the Environment and Public Works Committee. It was a very interesting process, but it provided an opportunity for everyone to have their say. Came up with a piece of legislation, submitted it, and the House wouldn't hold any hearings on it because I went to John Dingell, who was the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which had jurisdiction. And he said, look, young man, I was much younger than he was. And he would always refer to me as young man, I'm not going to have a bloodbath on this because you'll never be able to get it through the Senate. And we'll just have a bloodbath here and get something. Because in the Senate, you effectively have to get 60 votes. Or they can invoke, in order to invoke cloture and to stop debate, because they have a rule of unlimited debate, you can filibuster a bill to death, and you'll never get 60 votes. I said to him, well, you know a lot more about this place than I do, but the president's going to ask me if you're prepared to hold hearings. Do I have the following understanding with you? If we get a bill through the Senate, will you agree to hold hearings, produce a bill from the committee, bring it to the floor of the House? You can then pass it, and then we'll go to conference committee and work it out. He said, you'll never get it through the Senate. I said, you're probably right, but do I have, because he had a good relationship with the president. They had both been members of the House at the same time. I said, he's going to ask me tonight, because he knows we're meeting, what you said. Do I have your commitment that if we get the bill through the Senate, that he will bring something out of the House. Yeah, you have my word on that. I said, okay. So I went back and I said, Mr. President, you got a really unhappy camper in John Dingell. I don't think he wants any bill to do. But he did promise that he would bring a bill to the floor of the House if we got it through. Well, the administration presented their bill. We costed it out at $19 billion a year in costs. The Senate Environment and Public Works Committee bill, it was a large Democratic majority, produced their piece of legislation, which we costed out at $42 billion a year, a little more than double. Now, our bill only got 98% of the environmental benefits that their bill did. You're right. Their bill got 2% more and cost more than double. So Senator Mitchell he was the majority leader from Maine, and he cared a lot about this issue, went to Senator Dole, who was the Republican leader, and said, will you join me in going to the president and proposing the following? If I bring the administration's bill to the floor, it can't get 60 votes. And if I bring the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee bill to the floor, it can't get 60 votes. So will the president agree to have a leadership administration agreement, and we will negotiate a new bill, and you will agree to produce a majority of Republicans, and I will agree to produce a majority of Democrats, and the president will agree to sign the bill? Dole says, sure. So they come down and meet with the president and make this proposal to him, and he says, okay. And they said, okay, we're not going to negotiate with a whole bunch of people. You have to pick a negotiator to represent you at the negotiating table. And the president asked me since I'd helped put together the bill, if I would be the negotiator. And we met for 132 hours in the majority leader's conference room. Mitchell and Dole would sit there, the Democrats sat down this side of the table, the Republicans sat down that side of the table, and I would sit at the end, and we would go for hour after hour after hour, went through every provision in the bill. And here's what
Trying to find the common ground.
Trying to find the common ground. And what I found really interesting is that the bill that was produced, there were 99 of the 100 members of the Senate were in the room at one time or another. There were normally about 20 to 25. We would hold these in the evenings, usually starting at 7:30 or 8 o'clock, often going till 11 or 11:30. One morning we went till 1 o'clock in the morning. Any senator who wanted to be there, it would be announced, these are the provisions of the bill. It was an 800-page long bill. These are the provisions that we're going to be discussing tonight. And it was a process that worked, because when we finished and the bill came to the floor on final passage, this bill that had been gridlocked for 13 years passed 89 to 11, with the overwhelming majority of Republicans and overwhelming majority of Democrats in the session voting in favor of it. Why?
Because everybody had say.
Because they had found common ground.
But you said most everybody had rotated through as well.
Most everybody had come through. Some had been there Phil Gramm was magnificent. He was a senator from Texas, and he's one of the brightest people that I ever met in the Senate. He was an economist who had been an economist at Texas A&M before he ran for the House as a Democrat, and then thought he was going to be in a better position as a Republican, so he switched party. He actually resigned. He did the right thing. He resigned and said, I'm going to go back, and there will be a special election. This time I'm running as a Republican.
He didn't just switch.
He didn't just switch. I think that's sort of the honorable thing. Look, people, when they voted for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never heard of that.
Yeah. And but he was brilliant in these, because he's got a very creative mind.
What was creative with what he did?
We came up with a lot of market-based incentives that would get people to do certain things using market mechanisms. What we'd had before was what economists refer to as command and control regulation. The command part was we have identified X as the best available control technology backed. So if you're a utility and you're a coal burning thing, you have to put on this scrubber and it has to be fashioned in this way. And the control is, and then we're going to put monitors on it to make sure that it's working as advertised. So we command you what you have to do, and we monitor it and control it so that we know that you're doing it.
So there was nothing in it for anybody else.
So there's no innovation there because I'm just going to have to do what's available. By using a market-based system in which you have what's called emissions trading, if I can come up with a better way to take sulfur dioxide and hydrogen oxides out of the air, and it's above the level that I could sell those credits to someone else. Because what matters with respect to pollution is not what a single source is putting up. Because once it goes up in the air, what happens? It gets mixed everywhere. Most of it comes down. That's why you see these big smokestacks going. Most of it comes down between 500 and 700 miles from the place it
in another state. We talked about that.
Yeah. This is why the Canadians were so upset, because a lot of the pollution that was coming up in the United States was going there. And what do you think our response to them was? This was the number one issue for over a decade on meetings between U.S. presidents and Canadian prime ministers, was what to do about acid rain. And we said, well, your plants are along the border and your stuff goes up and comes down here. And they said, yeah, but there's 10 times as many of you as there are of us. and we're suffering from it. So
there was so they could sell their credits.
So
they could make some money.
Exactly. If you come up with something
innovative
that allows you to control the pollution below, you set a standard. Right at that time, for example, we were emitting 18 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the air. And we proposed reducing that by 10 million tons. That is going from 18 down to 8. Now, you're still allowing some pollution, 8 million tons, but it's very different from the 18 million tons. Well, to get down there, you've got to have a lot of innovation. You can't just shut everything down. That's the thing that I was worried about. I said, we can't shut the country down to try to deal with this issue. So we came up with a standard which says, if you can get below this standard, then you can sell your credits to somebody else who hasn't gotten there. And we were able to achieve the overall reduction of going from 18 down to 8 in a much more economically efficient way than if we had just gone to every point source and said, this is what you have to install or we're going to shut you down.
So instead of being innovative and command and controlled, you were innovative but could have some economic benefit from
Absolutely. It. And now...
Well, I mean, that's just human nature, right?
Sure.
If you tell a child, I can't do that, well, they're going to go do it. That's human nature. I think that's the difference between free enterprise America with, responsibility as opposed to a communist society where everything is just regulated and shut down and there's no incentive for anybody. It's just human nature.
Think of the changes that you have made in your life and the changes that other people make in their lives. Do you make those changes because somebody else is telling you exactly what to do and enforcing that? Or do you make those changes because you really want to and you are creative in figuring out how I can achieve this goal? I have this theory that human beings...
Freedom.
Human beings are the best judges of their own interests. They know what they care about and what their desires are more than anybody else. Most human beings want to be better. Most human beings get better faster when they are the energy behind that rather than someone else telling them. Now, do we look around for mentors to help us out? Every successful person that I've ever met has always had some great teachers or mentors in their life. But the teachers and mentors didn't tell them exactly what to do. I mean, as you know, you've raised children. It's a very challenging enterprise. When they're very young, you don't let a 2-year-old play unsupervised in the front yard on a busy street, but you allow a 16-year-old to. Well, you have to decide, when do they know enough? Because you want to protect them, but you know that you're not going to be with them forever. And so you're trying to figure out, how do I help them learn how to make wise choices? You hope that they will learn most of the most important things in life vicariously, because you can give them the benefit of your experience. Sometimes we all insist on learning things experientially, and then we come back and say, I wish I had taken your advice. I would have been much better off. But we need to do that as a society. The societies that are very rigid, and we refer to them as authoritarian now, which have a very oppressive regime that is determined to have things done in a particular way, are not the creative societies. They're not. Russia's a great example. What is made in Russia that you can remember going out and buying?
Those little dolls that fit inside the other dolls.
Exactly. But they basically live off natural resources, oil, natural gas, gold, second largest producer of gold in the world. But nobody buys their cars.
No. Or their computers.
Or their computers or that. Look at the countries that are constantly coming up. Or their clothes, yeah. If you look at the impact that America has on the world, part of that impact is in what we produce. We're by far the best agricultural producers in the world. We export about a third of it. Part of it is the innovations that we've come up in manufacturing, which have been spectacular. But a large part of it is our clothes, our culture, our TV shows, our movies. If you look all around the world, where is it that people want, what are they trying to imitate? They're trying to be like us. And they keep coming here wanting to be part of this culture that has not settled into what I like to call a comfortable complacency. We haven't come to the conviction this is as good as it can be. We just need to keep our hands on the wheel and not turn so that we can keep going down the same path. We are full of optimism that things can be better. And if we make the appropriate effort, we'll get better. But that requires a lot of effort. And that's why we need a system which is not trying to level everybody and make everybody equal in terms of results. You want to have it be a merit-based system in which everybody is incentivized to come up with new, fresh thinking and ways of doing it.
Well, everybody has their different talents.
Absolutely.
You know, one person's great in computers, another person might be wonderful in the arts, and everyone has their different.
And everybody knows what they like best. When students come and they say, so, which job do you think I should take? I've got these two offers. I say, well, just a second. What do you enjoy doing most? When you get up in the morning, do you want to get to this job? Do you think that it usefully serves other people? That's the first test. Do you enjoy it? Some people enjoy one thing, some people enjoy another. It's not right or wrong. In fact, it would be a pretty boring world if everybody had the same set of desires and preferences. But secondly, who are you going to be doing it with? Do you enjoy the people that you're going to be working with? Are you pleased to be associated with them? You don't have to admire them all, but you have to respect them all, and you have to be part. if you enjoy what you're doing with people whom you enjoy, you'll be just fine. The other stuff, how much you get paid, what size your office is, whether you have a parking place, all that, that'll take care of itself. Just don't be...
And none of that will matter if you're unhappy.
Let life come, and none of it will matter. I said, you could make a whole bunch of money and be very miserable. In fact, we have examples of people who have had that misfortune in their life. They've chased material things and come to discover that money can basically buy you comfort and convenience. It can't buy you happiness. It can't buy you satisfaction. It can't buy you character. All the things that really matter in life, money can't buy for you. But if you really enjoy, I mean, I've seen people who are great physicians who love what they do, and attorneys and business people and educators and movie stars. If they don't really enjoy it, then they don't have the same kind of success as if they really do enjoy it.
I think the kernel of whether you enjoy something or not, whether people realize it or not, is there a purpose, a higher purpose in this?
Absolutely.
You know, that's really, I think, one of the driving factors. You've just exquisitely expressed so much that's beautiful about America and our government and our people and our culture and so if you had to sum it up, I mean, because there's so many elements about the exceptional, what would be your, like, if you're not, if you had to pick a few things that was exceptional?
I would say we are exceptional as a country because we have genuinely embraced the idea that people should be free to shape their own destinies and not have a heavy-handed government. We have succeeded and are exceptional because we've embraced the idea that we're going to live by the rule of law, and everybody is going to be subject to the same set of rules. There's not a privileged group who get to have a different set of rules applied to them. That's a hard one because most societies have a structure in which some people have preference over others. And I think that's one of the key things. And then third, we're just a society that is in love with equality of opportunity. And if you look at the last 200 years and you ask, do people here have more opportunity than they had then? Whether it is women, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, young, whatever field it is in, we have way more educational opportunities now. Realize in 1950, half the adult population never graduated from high school. Now, if you're going to succeed in a society, you need to go out and get yourself educated. And it's become the norm that people recognize I have to develop a set of skills and abilities that are going to enable me to contribute to and succeed in a very rapidly changing world. And I see the rising generation because I get to see them all the time. They're really an impressive group of people. They're just eager to learn, eager to serve, and we need to spread that ethos as widely as we can and not get people basically thinking in zero-sum game mentalities and having, I've got to compete with and get better than someone else. Or control. And I think if we can do that and maintain our creativity and innovation, I think 100 years from now, we can say, yes, we're still an exceptional nation.
And the amendment process is pretty pivotal, isn't
Yeah.
it? That we had that with our Constitution. So freedom, a consistency of law, fairness of law, and opportunity.
An opportunity. Yeah.
You know what my mother used to always say to me? I was in Hollywood I was in New York City at 15 and Hollywood at 17. I'm modeling since the age of 3 and all this. But she used to say, luck is when opportunity meets preparedness.
Yes.
Excellent.
So you have to have that opportunity,
Yes.
but then you need to be educated
Exactly.
and have that preparedness for that.
Thanks for all the work that you and your colleagues are doing in this effort to help educate a large number of people, young and old, in what the opportunities are available in this country and the commitment that it takes to be a contributing citizen.
Well, thank you. Knowledge is power, right?
It is.
And we can't be a people where the government governs by the consent of the people if we're not a knowledgeable people about the mechanisms of how the country, how the government works.
Yep.
And it's we the people, not we the
That's right.
government, and all of that. So love everything you had to say
Great.
today. Thank you
Thank you
so
very,
much.
very much.